Hi everyone, in this video we're going to take a look at the chapter 14 story of Ecce Romani and translate it together. So you want to make sure that before you do anything, like I always tell you, you want to make sure that you have the vocab under control, that you've read through all of it, that you know the words, you've memorized them as best as you can. This way you can actually translate it and you're not going to be constantly living in the dictionary. The other thing that you want to do is make sure you have the grammar under control. So chapter 13 and 14 are hitting on the same idea, imperfect tense. So it's basically a continuation of what we covered in the last chapter. The one twist is in this chapter, they're introducing the imperfect of our irregular verbs, esse and posse, to be and to be able. So I'll show you how to do those in the imperfect tense. We'll do a quick review. But once you have the grammar under control, read through the textbook. Feel free to watch my grammar video if it helps, but just make sure that you've got it under control and you feel comfortable with it so that when you're translating this story, you're not getting caught up whenever you see an imperfect tense verb. You want to make sure that you can do it. The other thing that you want to do is always make sure you're reading this out loud. If you can read this story, you're going to hear when you're saying ba, right, which is a marker of imperfect tense, or when you're saying things like erat instead of est. You're going to catch that difference, which is the difference between present and imperfect tense. You'll hear that when you're saying this story and reading it aloud, or if you have someone read it back to you, you'll also catch this. So you want to make sure that you're getting your listening and speaking skills involved too. It'll help you as you translate this story. But before we do anything else, we want to come back and make sure that we have the imperfect tense under control. Just do a quick review. So you want to remember the word tense comes from the Latin word tempus, which means time. So when you're changing the tense of a verb, you're really changing when the action happened. You're not changing the action itself, right? You might still be walking, skipping, or jumping, but we're changing when it happened. Present tense is when an action is happening right now, right? So you say, I am walking. Imperfect tense is what we learned last chapter. It's something in the past, right? So you say, I was walking. The difference is it's repeated, continuous, or it happened over a period of time, right? Because there's a couple different ways we can use verbs in the past tense. We call it in English. This is just one of them. So it's really a continuous action. And we said in the last video, it's sort of like thinking of your 5th birthday. You can either look at a photo of it or you can watch a video of it. The imperfect tense is sort of like a video. So remember, to form the imperfect, you go to the infinitive, right, your second principal part of your verb, and you drop the RE. This is what we call the present step. Then you add your infix, BA. The BA is telling you that it's imperfect tense. Then we add on our personal verb endings, MST, mustisant, right? And we said for third IO and fourth conjugation verbs, you just want to make sure that there's an IE in front of the BA. So for instance, if you had ambulo, ambulare, which means to walk, we'd start with ambulare, the infinitive. We'd drop the RE. That would give us ambula, the part in blue here. Then we add BA, which is our imperfect infix, right, which means was. And then we add on our ending. So MST, mustisant. So if you wanted to say I was walking, you'd end up with ambula, bam. So that process you should feel pretty comfortable with from last chapter. But if not, just make sure that you feel okay with it and you can recognize it when you're translating the story. So the new piece of grammar that we're adding in chapter 14 is we're doing the same thing with irregular verbs. So you want to remember that irregular verbs, they're called irregular because they don't follow the same pattern as our normal or regular verbs, right? The two that you've seen so far are esse and posse. So esse means to be and posse means to be able. They're related to each other, right? So they do basically the same thing here. The trick is they're not using BA, right? Because they're irregular, you're not going to see a ba anywhere in here. Instead, they're going to use the stem ERA. So era is the way of announcing that this is imperfect tense. So for esse, all you do is you take the stem era and you add on your personal verb endings, MST, mustis, unt. So you're going to get eram, eras, erat, eramus, eratus, erat. For posse, you're doing the same thing, right? But you're taking the imperfect form of esse, so eram, eras, erat, and you just stick POT in front of it. So you get poteram, poteras, poterat. That's how you put them into imperfect tense. And this chart shows you esse and posse in present and imperfect tense, so you can see the difference, right? So again, they don't really look anything like each other because they're irregular verbs, meaning the present and imperfect tense versions. So sum becomes eram, es becomes eras, and down the line. The one thing that does stay constant is the personal ending. So they both have present and imperfect tense, both have MST, mustis, unt as the endings. But it's pretty easy. Once you get the hang of putting esse into imperfect tense, you're fine for posse. All you're doing is sticking POT in front of it. So this is a little review to make sure that you've got the imperfect tense under control. There's a lot more you can do to practice, but just make sure that you're feeling comfortable with this so that when we move forward right now and translate the story, you're able to recognize imperfect tense when you see it in the stories moving forward. So let's take a look at the story itself now that we've got the grammar under control. So again, what we're going to do, you should read this out loud, but what we're going to do is take it in pieces and highlight the different cases. So if we take the first paragraph, we're starting with this. Remember, red is nominative, blue is accusative, green would be genitive. There's no genitive in this first paragraph, but purple is or pink rather, is the ablative case. So just pay attention to how we're color coding it so that you can see where the subjects are, direct objects, and so on. So we start with ubi descendet rida in fossam, concidont omnes. So ubi means when, in this case, right? So we have when the rida, there's our subject, descendit, goes down or falls down in fossam, into the ditch, right? And again, fossam is accusative because you're showing motion into, it's falling into the ditch. So when the carriage falls into the ditch, everyone, omnes, concidont, falls down, right? So everyone falls down. And again, notice how it's present tense. We're not talking about the past. We're talking about the actual action right now of the carriage going into the ditch. So everyone falls down. Then we have nemo tamen, e rida cadet. So nemo means nobody. There's our subject. Nobody, however, tamen, right? Nobody, however, cadet, falls, e rida, out of the carriage. And again, it's ablative because we're showing motion out of something, right? So nobody falls out of the carriage, which is good. Then you have mox cuncti in viam e rida descendum, soliciti sed incolumes. So mox means soon. So soon, cuncti, everyone, right? It's very similar to omnes, means basically the same thing here. So soon, everyone, descendant, climbs out, right? So everyone climbs out, a rida, out of the carriage, and again, ablative because it's motion out of. So they climb out of the carriage and in viam, into the road. And again, viam is accusative here because you're showing motion into. So we're going out of the carriage into the road. So everyone climbs out. And everyone, cuncti, are described as soliciti, anxious, but incolumes, unhurt, or safe and sound, however you want to translate it. So they climb out of the carriage, they're anxious, they're worried because they just fell into a ditch, but they're incolumes, they're not hurt. Then you have Cornelius, quamquam gaudet, quod omnes sunt incolumes, ridaria miserum reprehended. So Cornelius is our subject, the dad. Then we have this side thought, right? The commas are showing you there's sort of a different clause here, a different thought in the middle of this sentence. You have quamquam, although. So although gaudet, he's happy because, or that, you could say he's happy that, omnes sunt incolumes, so everyone or all are safe and sound. Right? So even though you can translate this, although he's happy that all are safe and sound, meaning his family's safe. Ridaria miserum, that's a direct object. So the miserable coachman is not doing anything. Something's about to happen to the miserable coachman. What happens? Reprehend it. It's talking about Cornelius still. He scolds, reprehend it, the miserum ridarium, the miserable coachman, the driver, right? Cyrus. So he's still yelling at Cyrus because the carriage fell into a ditch, right? So he's blaming his slave. Then we have age sire, noli cessare, extrahe statum raedam e fossa. So we have exclamation points here. It's commands, right? And you notice the quotation marks too. He's talking to Cyrus, which is why our first piece is age sire. Sire is vocative, right? Because he's calling him by name. Age is our positive singular imperative. It means come on, right? So he says, come on, Cyrus. Noli cessare. There's our negative singular imperative. Because again, he's commanding. Noli plus the infinitive means don't do something. So he's saying don't delay. Noli cessare, don't delay. Here we have our third command, extrahe. And again, it's singular positive. So age is positive. It means come on. Noli cessare is negative. It means don't delay. And extrahe is positive. It means, do something. In this case, drag out, extrahe. So he says, drag out immediately, statum, the raedam, the carriage, e fossa, out of the ditch. So he says, immediately drag the carriage out of the ditch. He's telling Cyrus to get the carriage back up on the road. Cyrus egitor equos incitat. So Cyrus, there's our subject, the slave. Cyrus, therefore, urges on, incitat, the equos, the horses, right? It's accusative plural. Equi raedam strenue trahunt sed frustra. So the horses, there's our new subject, right? The horses, trahunt, they drag the raedam, the carriage, our direct object. They drag the carriage strenuously, strenue, but in vain. Again, frustra is ablative. It's saying how did they drag it? They dragged it in vain, frustra. Rida in fossa hiret immobilis. So the rida, the carriage, remains, is stuck, hiret, is stuck immobilis, motionless, in fossa, in the ditch. Then we have Cyrus eam movere non potest. Cyrus is not able, non potest, to move, movere, eam, it. The feminine, it's referring to the rida. He's not able to move. Then we have O sceleste inquit Cornelius, right? So Cornelius says, Cornelius inquit. O sceleste. Sceleste here is vocative. You can tell by the E ending. It's the adjective scelestus, which means wicked, but it's the vocative form. So he's calling Cyrus wicked. You could translate this as wicked one, right? Wicked man, however you want to say it. So he says, O wicked man, or O wicked one, Cornelius says. Tua culpa rida est in fossa. Right? So rida is our subject. The carriage is in the ditch in fossa. And again, it's ablative because you're showing position or location. So he's saying the carriage is in the ditch tua culpa, by your fault. So another way to translate this is it's your fault that the carriage is in the ditch. It means roughly the same thing, but literally tua culpa here is saying why. It's describing like why, the reason why the carriage is in the ditch. And it's saying by your fault, right? That's the way that it got into the ditch. So in other words, it's your fault that the carriage is in the ditch. Quid tu faciebas ubi cisium apropinquabat? Dormie basne? Right? So he's asking two questions here. Quid means what? The subject is to, and it makes sense because our verb is faciebas. Now you'll notice with faciebas, we flip to imperfect tense because now Cornelius is not going to be asking about what's going on right now. He's going to say what happened in the past. So he uses the imperfect to go back in time, right? So he says, what were you doing? Faciebas is you were doing. When it's a question, you just say, what were you doing? So what were you doing? Ubi, when the cisium, right, the carriage, or the chariot rather, apropinquabat was approaching. So when that light chariot was approaching, what were you doing? Right, he's asking his slave, his ridarius, his driver. Then he says, dormie basne. Here, the any just means you're asking a question where you're anticipating a yes or no answer. So you don't need to translate it as anything. It's called an enclitic. It's just stuck on the end of the verb. So pretend it's not there. The main verb is dormie bas. You were sleeping. But again, because it's a question, flip it around in English. He's asking, were you sleeping? Were you asleep? Right? Sextus interpellat. So Sextus interrupts. And he says, Cyrus non dormiebat, sed per viam placide ibat dum apropinquabat cisium. So Sextus interrupts, and he says, no, right? Because remember, Sextus was with Cyrus. He was sitting there when the carriage goes into the ditch. So he saw what happened. He says, Cyrus non dormiebat. Cyrus was not sleeping. Again, imperfect tense, he was not sleeping. But you have to go to the very end of the sentence to find apropinquabat. Something was approaching. The subject is cisium, right? The chariot was approaching, right? And you want to put this, you could even say ebot. Sorry, I went a little too far there. You want to go to ebot. He was going peacefully, placide. Per viam means along the road. So you're saying he wasn't sleeping, but he was going, ebot, peacefully along the road, per viam, while the cisium was approaching. Right? Doom means wow. So if you put it together, Sextus is saying, no, Cyrus wasn't sleeping. He was going peacefully, right? The cisium came at us. That's his defense, right? But literally he's saying he was going peacefully while the cisium was approaching. Then you have ego et Marcus spectabamus cisium, quod celerime apropinquabat. So Marcus and I, that's our subject. So in other words, we, Marcus and I, spectabamus, we were watching, right? What were they watching? The cisium, the chariot. So he says, we were watching that chariot because apropinquabat, it was approaching, meaning the cisium was approaching, celerime, very quickly. So he's saying we were watching it because it was coming so fast at us, right? Dende tabularius equos ad raedam nostram dever tebat. So dende means then or next. The tabularius, the courier, right? The person carrying letters. The courier, dever tebat, he was turning. Right? What was he turning? The equos, the horses. So he was, then the courier was turning the horses ad raedam nostram, towards our carriage. So he's saying, we didn't do anything, right? Cyrus didn't do anything. The tabularius is the one who turned the horses right towards us. Periculum erat magnum. There was a lot of danger, right? The danger was great, literally, is what this says. So you could almost say there was a great danger, meaning, it was dangerous what this guy was doing. Then you have Cyrus cisium vitare poterat et iam nos omne sumus incolumes quod Cyrus raedam magna arte agebat. So Cyrus vitare poterat, there's our irregular verb poterat. He was able to avoid the cisium, right, the chariot. And now, at iam, nos omnes, all of us, or we all, sumus, are incolumes, safe. Because, quod, Cyrus, there's our subject, agebat, was driving the raedam, the carriage, magna arte, with great skill. It's ablative because it's describing how he was driving the carriage. And again, you want to remember that when you have the ablative case, like magna arte, without a preposition, you want to think about what's it expressing. More often than not, it's saying how something happened. So in this last sentence, it's just saying how Cyrus was driving the carriage with great skill. So it's a longer sentence, but again, the thing you want to keep in mind is take a look at poterat, right? There's our irregular verb, posse, in the imperfect tense. And it's good to catch on that it looks a little different. It's got erat in the middle of it. You want to start practicing this so you can catch on what it sounds like and what it looks like when it's imperfect. So now we go to the last section of the story. You have tum Cornelius rogat, tune quisium spectabas marque, ubi apropinquabat. So then Cornelius asks, right? So Cornelius rogat, he asks. And notice he doesn't respond to Sextus because, again, Sextus is not his son. So he turns to his son Marcus, and he's kind of double checking what Sextus is saying. Maybe he knows that Sextus is kind of the pest, right? And he doesn't trust him, but he doesn't respond to Sextus. He asks Marcus a question, right? He says, tune quisium spectabas. Again, the ne on tune just means you're asking a yes or no question. Pretend it's not there. So tu is our subject, you, which makes sense because our verb is spectabas, right? You were watching. But again, because you're asking a question, he's saying, were you watching? Right, so he says, "Were you watching, Marcus, when the quisium, or in other words, you're saying, were you watching the quisium, Marcus, when it was approaching? Apropinquabat, it was approaching." So he's asking Marcus, he's like, "Were you watching this? What was the quisium doing? The chariot, right?" And then Marcus answers, "Ita vero pater," respondet Marcus, "omnia observabam." So Marcus responds and says, "Ita vero," yes, right? Yes, indeed, truly, pater, father. So he's calling, again, it's vocative. He's responding to his dad, and he uses the term pater. So he says, "Yes, father," responds Marcus. "Omnia observabam," I was watching, observabam, right? Imperfect tense. I was watching everything, omnia, right? So he says, I was watching everything. "Erat culpa tabellarii non Syri." So erat, it was, right? The culpa, the blame, and here we have genitives, of the courier, tabellari, of the messenger, not of Cyrus. So he's saying it wasn't Cyrus's fault, right? It wasn't the blame, the fault of Cyrus. It was the fault of the courier, right, is what he's saying. So yeah, he's like, Cyrus didn't do anything wrong. And he continues and says, Cyrus ride magna arte agebat. He repeats what Sextus just said. He says, Cyrus agebat was driving the ride-on, the carriage, magna arte, with great skill. Again, it's ablative, no preposition there. It's saying how he was driving the carriage. Then we finish with the last section. You have said Cornelius, magna ira commotus, virgam aripit, et raidarium miserum verberat. So, but Cornelius, there's our subject. And again, he's commotus magna ira. Commotus means moved, not physically moved, but emotionally moved, right? Is the idea. So he's moved by what? By great anger, ablative. It's saying what he's moved by or how he was moved. So moved by great anger, he aripit, he grabs a virgam, the stick. It's the switch that Cyrus was using to hit the horses, basically. So he grabs the virgam, the switch, and verberat, he beats the raidarium miserum, the miserable coachman. So again, they're trying to get at, in Ecce Romani, the idea of like how they treat slaves. And they hinted at this in the last section when they're talking about Cornelius being angry and a good master, you could say, but he gets angry. Here they're trying to show that a little bit more. So he's angry. He knows it wasn't Cyrus's fault, but he's still overcome or moved by anger, and he decides to beat his slave. Again, it is the unfortunate reality of how they would treat slaves. And that's what the book is trying to depict here. So at the end of the day, they do figure out that it wasn't Cyrus's fault, but either way, he gets punished because the rida, the carriage, is still in the ditch. So for this story, what you want to pay attention to is imperfect tense. Again, that's what we've been doing in chapter 13 and now in 14. Make sure you can recognize it. And when you see a verb as being imperfect, make sure you can translate it. Someone was or we were, that's the translation you probably want to use for most of them. Once you're comfortable with it, though, you'll see imperfect tense is pretty easy to spot, and it's something you can translate pretty easily too. So good luck with it. If you have any questions at all or anything you want to explain, feel free to put them in the comments. I'll help however I can. But otherwise, keep practicing, and I'll see you for the next video.